There is a certain kind of connection that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, and doesn't chase. It simply exists, quiet, deep, and powerful. And ironically, that is the very connection some people run from the hardest. Avoidant individuals don't leave because the bond is weak. They leave because the bond is stronger than their defenses. When someone meets a super empath, they aren't just seen, they are felt. And for someone who has spent their life surviving by staying emotionally distant, that level of closeness can feel overwhelming. Avoidants often tell themselves they want freedom, space, independence, but what they're really trying to escape is vulnerability. The super empath mirrors back parts of them they've never had to confront before. Their fears, their unmet needs, their buried emotions. That mirror can feel threatening. So they pull away, convince themselves they're better off alone, and try to disconnect from the intensity of the bond. Yet distance doesn't erase emotional truth. It only delays it. What makes this connection so difficult to break is that the super empath doesn't love conditionally. They don't manipulate or withhold to gain power. They offer safety, understanding, and emotional presence without forcing it. That kind of energy leaves an imprint. Even when the avoidant walks away, their nervous system remembers what calm felt like. Their mind remembers what it was like to be accepted without performance. And that memory becomes impossible to ignore over time. Eventually, the avoidant starts comparing every new connection to what they had. And while they may find distraction, they rarely find the same depth. Because the super empath didn't just offer love, they offered home. And once someone experiences that, running doesn't mean forgetting. It means circling back later with more awareness, more regret, or more readiness than before. This isn't about chasing someone who left. It's about understanding that real connection doesn't disappear just because someone was afraid of it. Growth happens when the empath stops shrinking themselves to be chosen and the avoidant learns that intimacy isn't a trap, it's a choice. When those two truths align, return isn't about need. It's about recognition. Avoidant. Individuals are often misunderstood as cold, indifferent, or incapable of deep connection, but the truth is far more complex. They don't pull away because they lack feelings. They pull away because feelings arrive with an intensity they were never taught how to handle. For them, vulnerability does not feel like intimacy. It feels like exposure. It feels like standing unprotected in a place where they once learned it was safer to rely only on themselves. So when a deep emotional bond begins to form, especially with someone who is naturally empathetic, open, and emotionally present, their instinct is not to move closer, but to retreat. A super empath doesn't demand closeness or force emotional conversations. Instead, they create an environment where authenticity is possible. They listen without judgment, respond with compassion, and allow emotions to exist without trying to fix or control them. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this kind of emotional safety can be deeply unsettling. It gently dismantles the walls they've built, not through pressure, but through consistency. And that consistency is precisely what activates their fear. When someone shows up calmly, repeatedly, and without conditions, it removes the familiar chaos that avoidants often know how to navigate. Stability for them feels unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. What the avoidant is really running from is not the person in front of them, but the internal experience that person evokes. Vulnerability asks them to acknowledge needs they learned to ignore, emotions they learned to suppress, and fears they learned to bury. It confronts the belief that closeness equals loss of independence or eventual pain. Many avoidants learned early on that relying on others led to disappointment, rejection, or emotional overwhelm. As a result, they develop self-sufficiency as armor. When a super empath invites emotional closeness, it threatens that armor, and the avoidant reacts by creating distance to regain a sense of control. This is why avoidants often rationalize their withdrawal. They tell themselves they need space, that the connection is too much, or that they're simply not ready. These explanations help them avoid the deeper truth, that intimacy is stirring emotions they don't feel equipped to manage. The more genuine the connection, the louder the alarm becomes inside them. It's not fear of love. It's fear of what love requires them to feel, admit, and risk. Ironically, the very traits that cause avoidance to pull away are the ones that later draw them back. The emotional safety they fled becomes something they miss once distance sets in. Away from the connection, the intensity fades, but so does the warmth, the understanding, and the sense of being truly seen. Over time, they begin to realize that what they labeled as overwhelming was actually vulnerability asking to be acknowledged. And that realization marks the beginning of growth, even if it comes long after they walked away. The super empath does not operate from a place of strategy or control. Their way of connecting is not about testing someone's feelings, creating insecurity, or withholding affection to gain reassurance. Instead, they lead with emotional clarity and genuine presence. They express care without demanding constant validation, and they allow space without withdrawing love. This balance is what makes their energy so distinctive and so disarming for someone with avoidant tendencies, who is accustomed to relationships defined by emotional push and pull. This steady openness feels unfamiliar and difficult to interpret. Avoidants often learned early that closeness comes with expectations, pressure, or eventual disappointment. As a result, they associate emotional intimacy with loss of autonomy. The super empath challenges this belief simply by being who they are. They don't invade emotional space or force depth prematurely. They remain consistent whether things feel easy or uncomfortable. There is no hidden agenda behind their kindness, no punishment for needing space, and no manipulation to secure closeness. This absence of control can feel unsettling to an avoidant because it removes the rules they know how to play by. Emotional safety, paradoxically, can be more frightening than emotional chaos. Chaos feels predictable to someone who grew up adapting to it. Inconsistency, emotional distance, or conditional affection may feel familiar, even if painful. The super empath offers the opposite: reliability, emotional attunement, and calm. They respond instead of react. They listen without defensiveness. They validate feelings without taking them personally. For an avoidant, this level of regulation can trigger discomfort because it invites them to lower their guard without giving them something to push against. Without control or manipulation in the dynamic, the avoidant cannot maintain emotional distance through familiar defenses. There is no dramatic conflict to justify withdrawal, no emotional pressure to rebel against. The super empath's grounded presence quietly exposes the avoidant's internal struggle. It brings to the surface questions they've avoided. Why does closeness feel unsafe? Why does being cared for feel heavy? Why does calm feel more threatening than distance? These questions don't come from confrontation. They arise naturally in the stillness the empath creates. This is often the moment when avoidants begin to pull back, not because something is wrong, but because something is real. Emotional safety removes the distractions that once kept them from feeling too much. The super empath's acceptance asks them to show up as they are, not as who they think they should be. That level of authenticity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like risk. So distance becomes the avoidant's way of regaining balance and control over their internal world. Yet even after they leave, the imprint of that safety remains. They remember what it felt like to be met with understanding instead of judgment, to be given space without emotional punishment, to be valued without being chased. Over time, that memory begins to challenge their old beliefs about intimacy. They may not return immediately, but the experience reshapes how they view connection. The super empath doesn't force change, they model it. And in doing so, they leave behind a quiet but powerful reference point for what healthy emotional connection can feel like. When an avoidant walks away, it often looks like detachment or indifference from the outside. Silence replaces closeness, and distance gives the impression that the connection has ended cleanly. But emotional reality doesn't operate on physical proximity alone. What was felt deeply doesn't disappear simply because contact has stopped. In fact, for avoidants, distance can create the very conditions that allow emotions to surface. Without the immediate pressure of intimacy, the feelings they pushed aside begin to re-emerge in quieter, more persistent ways. The super empath leaves behind more than memories. They leave an emotional imprint. This imprint forms because the connection wasn't built on intensity or drama, but on presence and understanding. Avoidants are often accustomed to relationships where emotions are either overwhelming or unavailable. The super empath offers something different: consistency without demand, depth without force, care without condition. That combination is rare, and rarity makes it unforgettable. The nervous system remembers what it felt like to be calm in someone's presence, even when the mind tries to rationalize the separation. Time does not erase this imprint. It often sharpens it. As avoidants move on and engage in new connections, they may notice something missing. Conversations feel lighter. Interactions feel seer, but the sense of being fully understood is absent. They might experience less emotional intensity, yet also less meaning. The comparison happens quietly and unintentionally. They don't set out to measure new people against the super empath, but the contrast emerges naturally. The depth they once avoided becomes the depth they begin to miss. This is where internal conflict grows. Avoidants value independence and emotional self-reliance, but the memory of that connection challenges the belief that closeness equals loss of freedom. The emotional imprint acts like a reminder that intimacy can coexist with autonomy. Even when they resist this idea, their body recalls moments of safety, laughter, or shared silence. These memories surface during still moments, late nights, quiet drives, or times of stress, when distractions fade and emotional truth becomes harder to suppress. Distance also removes the empath's regulating presence. While together, the super empath often helps soothe emotional overwhelm simply by being attuned and steady. Once gone, the avoidant may notice increased restlessness, irritability, or emotional numbness. They may not consciously link this shift to the absence of the connection, but the nervous system registers the loss. This can create a subtle pull back toward the source of that emotional balance, even if the avoidant doesn't fully understand why. Eventually, the imprint transforms into curiosity or reflection. They begin to reconsider moments they once dismissed, conversations they avoided, or feelings they downplayed. What once felt like too much is reinterpreted as meaningful. This doesn't always lead to immediate action, but it plants a seed. Emotional imprints don't demand acknowledgement right away. They wait. And in that waiting, they quietly influence how avoidants view connection, vulnerability, and the possibility of returning, not out of need, but out of recognition. After creating distance, avoidants often believe they have regained control. The intensity has eased, the emotional pressure has lifted, and life feels simpler again. At first, this relief can be convincing. They tell themselves that leaving was the right decision, that the connection was incompatible, or that they are better, suited to something lighter and less demanding. But as time passes, a subtle shift begins to take place. New connections enter their life, yet something feels different. Not wrong, just incomplete. Avoidants may find themselves dating, socializing, or forming attachments that are easier to manage on the surface. These relationships require less emotional exposure and offer fewer moments of vulnerability. There is comfort in that predictability. However, ease does not always translate into fulfillment. Conversations may flow, routines may form, but the depth that once existed is noticeably absent. Without intending to, the avoidant begins to compare, not obsessively, but instinctively. The mind starts to recognize the difference between connection and convenience. The super empath becomes the unspoken reference point, not because they were perfect, but because the bond carried emotional weight. With the super empath, there was a sense of being seen without performance, understood without explanation. In contrast, new connections may feel transactional or surface level. The avoidant might notice that they are more guarded, less expressive, or emotionally disengaged. While this feels safer, it also feels emptier, and that emptiness quietly points back to what was lost. This comparison often triggers internal tension. Avoidants pride themselves on independence and emotional self-sufficiency, so acknowledging that a past connection set a higher emotional standard can feel threatening. It challenges the belief that they don't need depth or closeness to feel content. As a result, they may resist these realizations at first, dismissing them as nostalgia or loneliness. Yet the pattern persists. No matter how many new people they meet, the same sense of emotional absence reappears. Over time, the avoidant may begin to reassess the narrative they created about the breakup. What they once labeled as overwhelming or too intense starts to look different in hindsight. They may recognize that the discomfort they felt wasn't caused by the empath's behavior, but by their own fear of emotional exposure. This shift in perspective is significant because it marks a move from blame to self-awareness. The comparison is no longer about who the empath was, but about what the connection revealed within them. This realization doesn't always lead to immediate reconciliation, but it does change how avoidants approach relationships moving forward. They may become more selective, less tolerant of shallow dynamics, and more aware of what true emotional compatibility feels like. The super empath's presence becomes a benchmark, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And once someone experiences that level of authenticity, it becomes difficult to settle for anything that lacks substance. The comparison, once resisted, becomes the catalyst for growth, and the quiet reason the avoidant begins to look back with clarity rather than fear. Growth for an avoidant does not happen in loud moments or dramatic realizations. It happens slowly, quietly, often in solitude, long after the relationship has ended. Fear is what governs an avoidant's choices at first. Fear of dependence, fear of losing autonomy, fear of being needed too much or not being enough. When they walk away, it is not empowerment driving them, it is self-protection. At that stage, return is impossible because fear still feels safer than intimacy. Distance feels like control, and control feels like survival. Over time, however, fear begins to lose its authority. Life has a way of confronting avoidance with the limits of emotional isolation. Distractions fade, surface connections repeat the same emptiness, and independence starts to feel less like freedom and more like disconnection. This is often when self-awareness begins to develop, not because someone forced it, but because patterns became impossible to ignore. The avoidance starts to recognize that the common denominator in their endings is not other people, but their own resistance to vulnerability. This is where growth quietly replaces fear. They may begin to question long-held beliefs about intimacy, that closeness leads to suffocation, that needing someone is weakness, that emotional reliance equals loss of self. These beliefs were once necessary adaptations, but growth allows them to be re-examined rather than obeyed. The memory of the super empath plays a role here, not as an obsession, but as a reference point. It stands in contrast to every shallow or emotionally distant connection that followed. What changes is not just how the avoidant views the super empath, but how they view themselves. They start to see moments where they shut down instead of speaking, pulled away instead of leaning in, intellectualized feelings instead of experiencing them. This awareness can bring regret, but it also brings responsibility. Growth means no longer blaming closeness for discomfort, but recognizing that discomfort was an internal signal asking for healing, not escape. When avoidants return, it is rarely impulsive. It happens when they feel more emotionally resourced, more grounded in themselves, and less threatened by intimacy. The return is not driven by loneliness or fear of being alone. Those motivations fade as growth solidifies. Instead, it is driven by recognition, the understanding that what they once fled was not danger, but depth, that the connection didn't demand their disappearance, but invited their presence. Importantly, growth also shifts how they approach the super empath. They are less likely to return with ambiguity or emotional distance, and more likely to seek clarity. Even if imperfectly, they may not be fully healed, but they are more honest about their limits and fears. Fear no longer dictates silence, it coexists with courage, and that is the true turning point. Return, then, is not about reclaiming what was lost, it is about meeting it differently. When growth replaces fear, the avoidant no longer sees intimacy as a trap. They begin to understand it as a choice, one that doesn't erase independence, but expands it, and only from that place does return become possible, meaningful, and real true connection has a way of revealing truths we can't outrun forever. What this journey ultimately shows us is that avoidance is not the absence of feeling, and empathy is not weakness. It is strength with boundaries. When someone runs from intimacy, it does not era. What was shared, it only postpones understanding. And when someone chooses to stop shrinking themselves to be chosen, they reclaim their power. Whether return happens or not, growth always does. Thank you for allowing this space for reflection, for emotional honesty, and for the courage it takes to look beneath behavior and into the deeper reasons we connect, retreat, and sometimes find our way back wiser than before.